You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to this week's MEMO's weekly conversation with me, Naseem Ahmed. I'm really excited with today's conversation. I'm joined by Rachel Shabi, British journalist and author. Hello, Rachel. How are you doing? Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
Rachel's done incredible work. She's written for The Guardian, The New York Times, The London Times, The Independent, Al Jazeera, amongst a number of other publications. But today, really, I want to speak to Rachel about her book, Off-White, The Truth About Antisemitism, which came out, I think, just 2 months ago in November 2024. And we'll also touch on your previous book, which you published in 2009, titled Not the Enemy, Israel's Jew from Arab Lands. So many of the themes of the book is weaponization of anti-Semitism, erasure of Arab Jewish identity. That's, I think, is the main topic of your first book, but we'll be touching on that, as I mentioned. The silencing of Palestinian advocacy groups, IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and many other topics, which will be the theme of our conversation today. But before I get to some of the main themes and questions, I'm basically just ask you, what motivated you into writing this book, given that you yourself acknowledge in the book that this topic is a minefield. So what made you want to enter this minefield?
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for inviting me to talk about and try and unpack some of these themes on this show. I really appreciate what you do more generally and more widely. The motivation for writing the book is the growing realization over the last, say, decade or so that the mainstream political and media conversation about anti-Semitism is unusable. It's a dumpster fire. It's providing more shade than light on the subject. It's a combination of bad faith and polarization and political use and divisiveness and misunderstanding, all of which has produced less understanding over the subject itself and also more disunity amongst progressive groups who might otherwise be united over their anti-racism. And so I wanted to untangle all the different things, all the different elements that had made this such a train wreck of a conversation. You mentioned some of them, such as the way that the term itself has been politicized and used to shut down Palestinian advocacy groups. There's also the hypocrisy of far-right anti-Semitism, which is essentially pro-Israel anti-Semitism that so often gets a pass. And there's also blind spots coming from progressive groups and reasons why it has become, not necessarily bad faith reasons, but nonetheless reasons why it has become untethered from our conversation about anti-racism more generally. So I wanted to pick apart all those themes in the hope that we could produce something that was better than the conversation currently being had and sort of reunite the struggle against racism.
So that's the truth about anti-Semitism in 2 minutes you've described for us. But before we dive into some of those questions, I want to basically pick your brain and get you to share some of your own experiences as a Iraqi British Jew. You've discussed this at length in your book, as I mentioned, in 2009, titled Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands. And that book explores the marginalization of Mizrahi and Arab Jews in Israel, a theme which is also examined by a number of other scholars like Ila Shawat in her book. And one of the key arguments she makes is that for Zionism to succeed, it had to not only erase the Palestinians, it has it had to also erase Arab Jews from its imagination to create and construct a new identity in Israel of a Western state. So how did this erasure, how has the erasure shaped contemporary discussions and understandings of anti-Semitism, racism? So can you just share some of your own experience as an Iraqi Jew, having written a book about this as well? How does the themes I've described play out in our contemporary discussions on anti-Semitism?
It's such a great question, and there's so many layers in which it's disrupted our understanding of Israel, of anti-Semitism, and of racism. One of the things that's happened is that we have this lens applied to Israel and wider issues around the Jewish diaspora of Ashken normativity, whereby, that's defined as looking at everything through the lens of European Jewry. And paradoxically, we see that coming from the progressive left as well as the right. I think that came about as Ella Shohat, who's a wonderful intellectual that, I really recommend everyone read. And, I'm building on her incredible work. I'm following her very large footsteps when I wrote that book about how Jews got whitewashed and de-Arabized, Jews from the Middle East got whitewashed and de-Arabized in Israel. And the whole idea being that because Zionism, in the way it is understood in the Jewish sense as a national project, came from European Jews in response to European persecution and rampant anti-Semitism, and was imbued by European nationalistic concepts of superiority, right? And of viewing anything that was non-European as inferior and other. And it therefore transposed all of that in its creation of this Jewish homeland in Palestine, which obviously, as Ella Shohat writes so eloquently, the primary victims of that were Palestinians who had to go through the experience of settler colonialism and the violence of that continues to this day. Then you have another level where Jews from Arab and Muslim countries were seen as inferior and had their identities as Arab Jews erased so that this new Israel could become a European construct. And that has produced an understanding of Israel as a Western construct. Now, partly that's because it is allied to Western countries that continue to support and fund and provide diplomatic cover for it. But the outcome of that, and I'm not making an equivalence, obviously the power dynamic is primarily with Israel and its Western allies. So I'm not making a power equivalence, but at the same time, you do see elements of the progressive left, particularly the pro-Palestine solidarity left, sometimes come out with appraisals of Israel as a European thing. And, why don't those Polish Jews go back to Poland? Which again is like perpetuating this misconstruction of Israel as this, a European project that somehow got lost and ended up in the Middle East, as opposed to a country where the majority population, if you include Palestinians and Jews from Arab and Muslim lands, is actually Middle Eastern. So it all contributes to this sort of confusion that we have around how Israel is constructed. And what I suggest in my book might be a useful frame for our understanding is to pan back and see that everyone who is in that region, Israel-Palestine today, is in some way impacted by and affected by European racial thinking and colonialism, whether that's the Holocaust, whether that's the Nakba, whether that's the European colonialism that affected Jewish populations in the Middle East and North Africa, French colonialism, British colonialism. And so panning back and seeing that wider imprint of European colonial racial thinking might be a more useful frame for us to appraise that situation.
And in that frame, I suppose the idea of a Judeo-Christian civilization, which has gained more and more prominence over I would say, in the last, since 9/11 in particular, and more so now after October 7 attack, there's a real push to describe the link between Israel and the West as part of a much broader Judeo-Christian civilization. And someone like Douglas Murray, I heard him once even say something like, if Israel falls, then the whole of Western civilization will fall. So this idea is a part of the reconstruction of Jews being centered in the West, even though, as you mentioned, there's a huge population of Mizrahi Jews who lived in Iraq for a millennium, who lived in Morocco, who lived in Middle East. Jews are indigenous to the Middle East. But this idea of a Judeo-Christian civilization somehow seems to erase the fact that, Jews are also, there is a Judeo-Islamic civilization or Judeo-Muslim civilization, which is, I would say, much, much longer in history than the Judeo-Christian definition, which I think became prominent after the Second World War.
Yeah.
But I guess the question is, why is it the Judeo-Islamic civilization has been marginalized, almost erased, and the Judeo-Christian has become so prominent in the minds of many Jews and also people in the West? That I assume is part of the erasure that's happening to cement Israel as at the core of Western civilization.
Yeah, I think you raised so many interesting points and insights there. I think, first of all, you're absolutely right that all of this accelerated in the post 9/11 era. And part of that was because, it has to be said, Israeli leaders were interested in accelerating that association. So right after 9/11, you did have Israeli politicians, including the now Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, try and cement the connection, the idea that what the US had experienced in 9/11 was the equivalent of what Israel had been dealing with for decades, i.e. that Israel was not engaged in a Palestinian political struggle and resistance against a military occupation and a system of rule that many human rights organizations, including Israeli ones, have concluded is an apartheid rule, that they weren't resisting that, but rather that Israel was just dealing with some kind of local franchise of the war on terror. And so there was an effort to cement that association. But you're also right that, a Judeo-Christian heritage isn't really a thing, right? It doesn't have any meaning historically, culturally, religiously, intellectually. It was pushed forward primarily by the US in the post-World War, post-Holocaust era as a means of bringing Jewish people into the Western fold. It was a sort of inclusion thing after the horrors of the Holocaust, and a part of the way in which Jewish people, by and large, with all the caveats about Jews of color, Black Jews and Middle Eastern Jews who aren't functionally white, it was part of the way in which they were absorbed into whiteness. But it's actually meaningless as a term. It was picked up by all kinds of politicians of all stripes across Europe as well. And obviously the groups most overtly making hay with it, making political hay with it now, are the far right, because for them, that means that they can present themselves as defenders of Jewish people while being rampantly Islamophobic, right? But it does, exactly as you say, it erases this centuries-long actual hyphen, an actual meaningful hyphen that was Judeo-Islamic, that even just looking at the heyday of Al-Andalus, that period when a part of Spain was under Islamic rule, and Jewish and Muslim communities there shared a golden age, in part because they were dialoguing in Arabic, a golden age that produced all kinds of peaks in literature, architecture, philosophy, mathematics, algebra. It produced a pinnacle of Jewish thought as well. And it produced incredible Jewish philosophers, poets, and rabbis that are still well known and cited today. Ibn Firol, Yehuda Halevi, Moses Maimonides, right? And all of that has just been memory hold, like it was never a thing. So that Judeo-Christian can be a construct, and so that Muslims can be marginalized and persecuted and demonized. So it's really obviously doing a lot of damage in the way that it makes permissible the Islamophobia that isn't just a part of a far right, but actually has permeated the mainstream conversation. It's also just incredibly offensive if you are Jewish from the Middle East, if you have parents like mine with Iraqi heritage who are steeped in that hyphenated culture, right? And we now live in a reality where it's constantly made invisible.
Yeah, and it's a narrative where it makes every Muslim guilty of anti-Semitism until they prove otherwise. And it's almost like, anti-Semitism somehow built into our text, our way of thought, our cultures. And that's far from the reality. The reality was that Jews are indigenous to the Middle East. They have lived in the Middle East for millennium. And Abi Schleim in his book comments on how for 2,000 years, Jews were living in Iraq. His family were living a really comfortable upper middle class lifestyle.
Yeah.
Empires came and fell in parts of Iraq, Syria, but Jews have been a constant, in the Muslim world. And it wasn't until 1948 that you saw the rapture that happened. But I don't want to get into that. But the point being that this artificial construct of a Judeo-Christian civilization that's been created is used as a rod against Muslims to say that, you guys have been anti-Semitic for me. No, it's completely the other way around. Europe has throughout its history been anti-Semitic, and anti-Semitism is ingrained within, you can say, European cultures and civilizations, which is why you have had many, many pogroms. So we could make that argument, but I don't want to dwell on that. I wanted to get to your book and pick up some of the threads. And one of the key thread is the fact that anti-Semitism has become a term that's very misconstrued and it's quite confusing. And you argue that confusion is built into the definition itself. So can you explain a bit of that? How is confusion built into our understanding of anti-Semitism itself?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, if we understand anti-Semitism to mean hatred and prejudice towards Jews as Jews, whether as individuals or as a collective, that's in its essence what anti-Semitism is. At the same time, it's constructed as a conspiracy about power, which means this is the bit where we can see that confusion is built into its mechanisms, because it's essentially a means of misdirection. It's a way for people in power historically, and this was historical across Christian Europe, which is the origin story of anti-Semitism, where rulers and people in power across Europe would set Jewish people up as a potential scapegoat. So certain communities within the wider Jewish population were set up with some power and some privilege, so that in moments of political crisis or threats to those actually in power, those people in power could say, look over there, it's the Jews. They're the ones that are the source of all your troubles, which is what produced, persecutions and pogroms and pylons against Jewish people. So essentially built into that mechanism whereby it's a conspiracy of power is this element of misdirection. And that is why, as well, anti-Semitism can be pretty much anything you want it to be. If it's a conspiracy about power, then it can be, Jews can be responsible for anything. Communism, capitalism, secretly plotting to undermine Western elites by flooding them with migrants, as in the Great Replacement theory. It can be anything, but it is constantly a misdirection about where power truly lies.
And another important observation in the book is just how the people who have historically been at the front line fighting anti-Semitism and racism, they are now being tarnished with the brush of anti-Semitism, while historically those who were the biggest anti-Semites are now seen as the champions of anti-Semitism. For the first, we could cite, for example, many will cite the Corbyn era, how during his period, the left became tainted with the brush of anti-Semitism, and over the past few years, we've all seen how someone like Tommy Robinson, the founder of the far-right English Defence League, who's at the moment in prison, he was rebranded himself as a defender of the Jewish people and also a defender of Israel. So how did this? It's just an incredible shift. How did this shift take place, where those who are traditionally the anti-Semites, or they became the champions, and those who are traditionally the champions of promoting minority rights and combating all forms of racism, they are now the biggest anti-Semites? How did this shift take place?
So first of all, leaving aside for a minute the shift in the far right, but I do want to get onto that. First of all, we have to acknowledge that the progressive left has some agency and responsibility in this. I think that other racialized minorities would say something similar about anti-racists who think they're racist, anti-racist, but actually we're in societies where racism is built in to our structures and embedded in our societies. And quite often people do have areas of ignorance over racism, and that would include anti-Semitism. And so again and again and again in the Corbyn era, you would see people just demonstrate straightforward ignorance about anti-Semitism and then a denial that they had that ignorance in the first place. So there is an element of, taking responsibility there. What you're talking about, though, is this incredible sleight of hand of the far right. And we see it in the US, but we also see it across Europe. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders; in the UK, as you say, Tommy Robinson; France, Marine Le Pen; Hungary, Viktor Orban. They've all done this incredible rehabilitation where they performatively pretend to care about Jewish people and cast themselves as defenders of Jewish people. And that defense is supposedly self-evident in the fact that they support Israel, right? And in so doing, they have recast themselves as anti-racists and rehabilitated their political fortunes, which allow them to be horrendously Islamophobic and anti-migrant. And it's an incredible, strategically, it makes sense that they would do that. Operationally, what it means is that we have this horrible political landscape where there is a perceived hypocrisy over anti-Semitism, where our political and media focus seems relentlessly to be on, what Palestine solidarity students are saying at Gaza campus protests or on marches that are just regular people crying out for the slaughter in Gaza to stop. There's a media and political preoccupation with that, while there's absolute hypocrisy and a pass given to the rampant and very dangerous anti-Semitism coming from the far right, whether that's in the form of Great Replacement theory, which is rapidly mobilizing and gaining traction across far-right movements and responsible for actual violence against Jewish people in a synagogue, against Muslim people in a mosque, Christchurch, Pittsburgh for the synagogue, against Mexican Americans and African Americans in the US, or whether that's the terrible anti-Semitism that's driving Christian Zionism, say. So all of these things just don't get the necessary attention. And it just looks like there is this hypocrisy in the mainstream conversation about anti-Semitism that, again, makes it hard for us to engage and have a coherent conversation about it.
So you mentioned a number of points there. I want to pick up on how the far-right use their concern for Jews performatively. What is that doing to Jewish communities who are traditionally acute to the rise of the far right, acute to racism in society, and the fact that anti-Semitism has become more or less an issue that is championed or defended by people like Robinson, people like the far right? What is it doing to the Jewish communities in Britain, in the US? Can you speak a bit about that? Because I can imagine that this can be a source of extreme concern, that the people who traditionally have been the most hostile to Jews are now presenting themselves as the champions of Jews. How is this being treated by the Jewish communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can say that I personally find it incredibly insulting and offensive and dangerous. At the same time, I think we can say that the response has been mixed, because there are Jewish individuals, groups that do find that appeal in that, do find appeal in the idea that these people seem to be standing up for Israel, seem to be claiming to fight anti-Semitism, which they have defined as criticism of Israel, right? So that has traction amongst some Jewish people, but at the same time, it is incredibly concerning. There are elements, there are progressive Jews who are incredibly alarmed by this political landscape, and also the divisiveness that it brings into progressive movements that are trying to tackle racism collectively. Also, when you look at, even the impact on Jewish communities, say the Hungarian Jewish community, where they have to deal with this far-right authoritarian Viktor Orban, who ran a blatantly, nakedly anti-Semitic election campaign that involved demonizing the Jewish philanthropist, billionaire philanthropist, George Soros, just an overtly, classically anti-Semitic campaign, which, the Israeli prime minister pretended wasn't happening as he forged his relationship, very clubbable relationship with Viktor Orban, but which the Hungarian Jewish community and representatives of were very alarmed by, and were saying to Netanyahu and to others, look, any responsible political leader should call this out for what it is and for its impact on the Jewish community in Hungary. So, for people who are in the crosshairs of this conversation, it is incredibly dangerous, because that has an impact for them, on the streets, that has an impact. So, yeah, I'd say it is quite mixed across the board, but at the same time, I do think it's the work of the progressive left to challenge that and actually understand the mechanisms of what's going on. There's a chapter in my book about it, so that we can tackle it, so that we can challenge it, and also be able to talk about anti-Semitism in a way that is tethered to our anti-racist movements, so that it doesn't look like the only people who are talking about defending Jewish people are the far right.
Yeah. A lot of what we're discussing can be explained by one phrase, which you use in your book as well, new anti-Semitism. So can you explain what that is? I mean, just explain what that is, and also how that ties into the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the definition which has been pushed by many of the advocates of Israel in the UK, and also in the West in general, and the US. I think in the US, the Congress has accepted that as the definition of anti-Semitism above some of the other less controversial definitions of anti-Semitism that does not conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. So just explain the new anti-Semitism, which, as I mentioned, is the source of much of what we are discussing, and how that feeds into the current debate about the IHRA.
Yeah. So, as you rightly say, the new anti-Semitism has had an impact in all kinds of different ways. We can trace, and actually a lot of scholars have traced the genesis of the new anti-Semitism back to the mid-70s. The UN General Assembly had a vote whereby there was a declaration to eliminate all forms of racism, including apartheid, neocolonialism, and Zionism, which was constructed as a form of racism and racial discrimination. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why that came about. Some of them very good reasons, like Palestinians who had constantly been trying to articulate, not trying to, but articulating their experience of Israel as settler colonialism, gaining traction on an international stage, but also it being part of a sort of Cold War dynamics with America and the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union actually was discriminating against Jewish people and was using this resolution as a bit of a Cold War power play. So there were all kinds of reasons tangled up in that vote. But the outcome for Israel was that they were totally shocked and alarmed by this. And the mindset shifted. So whereby the founding fathers of Israel, like, the person who's considered one of the founding fathers of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, would say about Israel that it actually would eliminate anti-Semitism if there were Jewish people having a regular state like regular people. There would be no need. Anti-Semitism would disappear. That changed. So you started to see in the response to the UNGA resolution, you started to see this new construct whereby anti-Semitism was actually attacks on the collective of Jewish people in Israel. And you see that becoming this field of interest for politicians, for think tanks, for academics, and also for diaspora Jewish groups outside of Israel who are increasingly binding their political affiliation with Israel, particularly post-67 and the Arab-Israeli war. And so this thing just got more and more traction, and we really have seen it be used overtly, actively, politically in the 2000s. Where you could see critics of Israel be silenced with claims of anti-Semitism. And of course, in these last 15 months of a war that leading expert organizations around the world have described as genocidal, anybody protesting that, anybody crying out for that to stop, whether it's marches, whether it's the UN, whether it's pop singers or actors, everybody is decried as anti-Semitic. And so the outcome is, first and foremost, that Palestinian voices who are needed now more than ever get silenced. There are, real material consequences, careers, reputations destroyed when people who are trying to speak up for Palestinians get accused of being anti-Semites, which is devastating in and of itself. And at the same time, the side effect of all this, and this has been terrible for anti-racist movements, is that if you're going to say that criticism of anti-Semitism of Israel is anti-Semitic, if you're going to say that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, then fighting anti-Semitism doesn't look like fighting racism anymore. It looks like defending people who are racist against Palestinians, right? And so it degrades the meaning of that word when it comes to anti-racists. And it also produces this thing where, and you see this across social media, where people start to wear it as a badge of honor. Like, if you're not accused of anti-Semitism, you haven't been doing your Palestinian advocacy solidarity right. And so it's degraded the very term and our understanding of it, at the same time as having this terrible effect on free speech when it comes to speaking up about what's happening for Palestinians.
I think what you're saying, the themes we're discussing, really comes together now since 7 October, over the past 15 months. We've seen the what you just mentioned. Some people will come out and say, if being opposed to genocide is anti-Semitic, I am anti-Semitic. People wearing the label with pride, which is not good for those who are genuinely trying to fight anti-Semitism. If you have people now saying, okay, this term has become so confused, so diluted that, if defending genocide against, if combating genocide means you'll be labelled, so be it, I'll be labelled. So it can't be a good thing. And on top of that, we are seeing pro-Palestinian groups being suppressed and cracked down. There are laws being passed in the US that are also doing that to strip people of, not strip, but expel students in the US who are seen to be supporting Hamas. Whether it's true or not, we can't really say, but the point is there's a concerted effort to crack down on pro-Palestinian activists, both sides of the pond. So I guess, the themes we're discussing, how have the past 15 months really crystallized what we are talking about? The crackdown, the dilution of the definition of anti-Semitism, the confusion of the definition itself, and what has that done the past 15 months to our understanding? Has it made things even more confusing? Has it become more clear to you as to what anti-Semitism means, or are you seeing anti-Semitism being weaponized in a way over the past 15 months, which makes it even more hard, to make it to combat anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and we're still dealing with the horrors like unfolding every day of what's going on in Gaza. The Runnymede Trust, which is an organization that deals with anti-racism, a few months ago they put out a report about Islamophobia, and in the last month they put out a report about anti-Semitism. And one of the things they point out in that report is that the fact that it has been so politicized has actually fueled this misunderstanding. It's made it harder to tackle anti-Semitism, and it's also sort of unmoored it from a progressive attempt to tackle anti-Semitism, tackle racism collectively, like all racialized minorities being in it together. It's had a sort of more siloing effect. So, I do think that has been accelerated in the last 15 months. I do think we have seen, obviously, as you described, we've seen an acceleration of crackdowns of so many people, so many organizations being accused wrongly of anti-Semitism, that it has had a devastating effect, and at the same time has eroded its meaning. And at the same time, we see the far right making political hay with this, either by, championing Israel in this so-called clash of civilizations, or actually there's quite a few on an individual level, there's quite a few sort of far right, essentially grifters who have latched on to the Palestinian cause and have millions of followers, like huge traction. They've latched on to the Palestinian cause, but actually they're the far right, they're right wing. So they're mainlining a load of anti-Semitism into their conversations. about, say, Gaza or what Israel's doing in Gaza. And I think one of the things that I see more and more as well is this idea of, and this is something that your Muin Rabbani talks about a lot, which I really appreciate, is that he always has an appraisal of what the geopolitical dynamic is. Israel is the client state of America. It's not the other way around. However, in the last 15 months, because we've seen Israel essentially do whatever it wants in Gaza, completely decimate the strip itself while killing and maiming and terrorizing the population. And we've had this thing where, the US President Biden, for months and months was not able, or claiming to be not able, to stop this from happening. We have people watching this on our news feeds every day and thinking, well, why? Why is Israel allowed to do this? Why does it get away with it? And of course, that in itself, without a geopolitical appraisal of exactly why so many countries are allied, so many Western countries are allied to Israel, minus that geopolitical appraisal, of course, that's going to fuel conspiracy theories about power and Jewish power. So I've seen that.
And resentment, I would say, and resentment. I think if you feel this, there will be a growing resentment among sections of society who think that, look, why do they get away with it? Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah.
Yeah. And absent the answer within our movements, and again, this is why I really appreciate Muin Rabbani's work, where he's very rigorous in his geopolitical analysis of what actually is happening and who is the client state in this equation and what the geopolitics of this are. Absent that in our everyday conversations and our baseline appraisal, where does that resentment go?
Yeah. I mean, let's end with this final question, just looking ahead. What do you think needs to change to reclaim the conversation about anti-Semitism for real progressives and people who genuinely want to combat anti-Semitism, for them to reclaim the fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of racism? What do you think needs to change in this regard going forward?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we have an incredible challenge here, that it's incredibly difficult work to do, partly because so much of it involves separating out what we see as a structure, an analysis of power, from people's individual and personal experiences. So, when we look at the way that, for instance, the idea of Jewish trauma plays out in all of this. So not just the historical, but the idea that Jewish people in Israel and more widely might have been traumatized by the horror of October 7. And at the same time, precisely that trauma has, through the decades and in this present moment, been used politically to justify the most appalling treatment of Palestinians, settler colonialism, the ethnic cleansing, the constant daily violence, apartheid system, and now a genocidal war. That we have a political architecture that leans heavily into using that trauma as a pretext or a justification. And at the same time, we now have to look at the Jewish individual showing up in progressive camps as an individual and not as a representative of that structure, right? And that's a challenge in this moment, but it's also essential that we do that we see, we allow individuals to bring with them the sentiments that they bring without automatically attaching a political motive or a political architecture to that. I think that's part of the challenging work, that we have to have these conversations in spite of the political and media conversation around Israel, around anti-Semitism. We have to do it in spite of those conversations, and create our own conversations, because actually those mainstream ones are unusable. They're garbage and they're dividing our movements.
Which is partly why I'm having this conversation with you to reclaim the fight against anti-Semitism and not allow it to be used as a weapon to advance Israel's project in occupation of Palestinian territories. So I think it's an important conversation. And I want to thank you, Rachel, for joining us and sharing your thoughts and also writing this really important book. So those of you who haven't read the book, it's Off-White, The Truth About Antisemitism, came out in November last year. And also do read Rachel's other book, just as important, I would say, Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands. Both books will really give you deeper insight into, I would say, what the fight against contemporary and modern anti-Semitism should look like. So I want to thank you, Rachel, and thank everyone who have tuned in. And see you again for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor next week.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much for having me on, and thanks for everything you do.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.